Thank you, Julianne. Gainesville is privileged to have the Florida Museum of Natural History. It's one of the most comprehensive university-based natural history museums in the U.S., and it has over 40 million specimens and artifacts in its permanent collection. Our speaker today is its director, Professor Douglas Jones. Dr. Jones received his PhD in 1980 from Princeton University, and he's been the curator of paleontology at the museum since 1985, and is also professor in the departments of geology, geological sciences and biology at UF. Dr. Jones has authored over 150 scientific and technical papers and edited several books, including, most recently, The Geology of Florida. He's the past president of the board of directors of the Florida Association of Museums, the Association of Science Museum Directors, and was chair of the board of the American Alliance of Museums, which represents the 30,000 plus museums in the United States. So he's a very busy man. And the title of his talk today is Growing a Museum in the 21st Century. So without further ado, here is Professor Douglas Jones.
Okay, well, thank you. Very busy, but still not busy enough that I can't take out the garbage and mow the lawn and all the rest. So you almost made me sound superhuman, which I certainly am not, John. But it's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of the components of the museum in terms of how we look at ourselves and where we think we're going. So I want to emphasize as a theme for this talk that the museum of the 21st century, especially as we think about the mid-21st century where we're headed, is not the same museum of the mid-20th century or the mid-19th century where we came from. And so I'll show you what I mean by that as we try to be relevant. So okay, good. F, that's probably forward, or it's failure, I don't know. There we are. Okay, so I think most of you have been to the Florida Museum of Natural History on the campus. This is our Education and Exhibition Center over at the UF Cultural Plaza. We are called the Florida Museum of Natural History now, but we began as the Florida State Museum and celebrated 100 years as the Natural History Museum, the State Museum of Florida, back in 2017. And the museum actually came to Gainesville from Lake City when the University of Florida was put together in 1906. So it was right there from the very beginning of UF in Gainesville. In fact, it came from Lake City, the Florida College of Agriculture, and the historical reports say that the objects were loaded into horse-drawn wagons, and the drivers of the wagons were given shotguns because the populace in Lake City did not want to see the museum leave Lake City and move to Gainesville, and they were afraid there could be trouble. So, so there you have it. Luckily, there wasn't, as far as I know. And so here we are in Gainesville. And so the museum has moved around a few places. And when you think about museums, the stereotype is all the action has already happened. It doesn't really relate to what's going on today or into the future, but a nice place to visit, to see things under glass that might be rare or might be beautiful, might be unusual, but interesting to look at, but what does it have to do with today? One of the places that the museum lived for a while when it moved off the UF campus to downtown was in the Siegel building, which I think is still despite all the skyscrapers which are going up around town. I think it's still the tallest building in Gainesville, right on University Avenue, and it occupied a few floors, but this is what it looked like. And that's really different than how the museum looks today. So this is the main hall in Powell Hall, the building Powell Hall. And the museum is open 362 days per year. It's free to the public, although we charge for temporary exhibitions that we lease and bring in, and we charge for the butterfly rainforest because we have to constantly purchase new butterflies and plants that are in flower all the time to keep those butterflies alive. And so you can see it's a very different philosophy about museums. I wouldn't say we're ready to have people touch everything, so there is that, but it's much more interactive, and this is the Hall of Florida Fossils. It is Shark Week, and so, it gets a lot of extra attention this time of year. This is our Lepidoptera Center, the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity. The collection there is probably the largest in the world. Certainly, it's the largest collection of scholars, faculty, staff, and students who are working on Lepidoptera, and we have more than 10 million specimens of butterflies and moths. It's quite a great research resource. So among the exhibitions that we have are some that we produce ourselves, and many of these are based on research that's done at the museum. This was one we had a few years ago called Titanoboa, the largest snake that ever lived. And this is a recreation of what that snake was like. We did this in partnership with the Smithsonian, and it's too bad that they chose a gator for the snake to be eating. It didn't play out too well in Gainesville, but they loved it in Tallahassee for some reason. I'm not sure. And that snake was based upon fossil remains of Titanoboa, which you can see in the top picture. Over on the left-hand side is an actual vertebra of Titanoboa, which was found in Colombia, in a coal mine in South America, Colombia. And then to the right for scale is the similar vertebra from a 20-foot anaconda for comparison. So that big snake was probably 50 feet long and would just barely fit through a door. So it was a huge creature, and we're probably glad that it's not around today to scare us. Well, this is another exhibit that we did recently or a few years ago called First Colony, Our Spanish Origins. And this is the story of America's first enduring European settlement over in St. Augustine. These are some pictures. The exhibit now is over in the governor's house, but I think it's actually in storage right now. It's moved out, right, Roy, because of the next exhibit that's over there. But this was based on archaeological excavations by Dr. Kathy Deegan and her students and colleagues that were focused on the Fountain of Youth Park in St. Augustine, which is just north of downtown St. Augustine, about a mile. And this was the original site of Pedro Menendez de Avila's in 1565, the first colony site. So lots of artifacts from there and lots of interesting stories to tell about what these people from Spain and encountered when they came to the New World. The people and the artifacts and so forth. And today we have another exhibit that we have produced called Fantastic Fossils. This is part of a new initiative we're calling Science Up Close. So Fantastic Fossils will be there until January 1. So you have plenty of time to go and see it. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to. It's really an interesting exhibition. We have people in there all the time who are preparing fossils that have been found in some of our local excavations. So we have a big excavation I'll talk about a little later down in Williston, Florida, that is exposing some very, very fascinating fossils. And we also have live streams from the field. So periodically on the TV screens at different times during the day, some of the scientists who are out in the field excavating fossils will explain to whoever is there in the audience what they're finding and its significance. We also have some of the 3D modeling of what these animals looked like when they were actually alive. So it's it's a really cool hands-on experience for many of our visitors. This is part of the live lab. The student on the right is explaining to a crowded field about what she is doing for her PhD, and a lot of interactivity. We've got a lot of good feedback. The next exhibit that we're going to have, I'll just warn you, is called Spiders Alive. So, some of you may want to attend, some of you maybe want to pause and hear what your friends think about it first, but that's going to arrive in January and will be here through the summer. It's an interesting exhibition. We've seen it elsewhere. It started out at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and I think you'll really enjoy it if you put forth the effort to attend. Now, we are planning to renovate the first of our major exhibition halls, which, if you've been to the museum, right behind the Mammoth when you walk into the Central Gallery is a big exhibition hall called Northwest Florida, Waterways and Wildlife. And that has been in place now for more than 20 years. So almost 24 years. And so we are going to replace that with a new permanent exhibit called Water Shapes Florida. Subject of water is so important for our state that the museum is trying to enter into some of these areas that are of great public concern and societal significance. So this is another one of the ways that our exhibits are trying to tell stories and engage the public in topics that they really need to become more familiar with. And so these are some of the drawings of what different rooms will look like. You're going to enter into like a cabin at a state park, and you'll be able to walk into the cabin and hear a simulated rainstorm, and then you'll be able to walk out. The cave is going to stay for all of you cave fans. We don't dare take the cave away. My inbox would be filled with complaints all the time. But it's going to be upgraded so that it'll look a little more realistic, and we'll have new generation lighting in there, so it won't be as warm, and we'll have a lot of nifty upgrades. You'll also be able to ride in a glass bottom boat like you used to in Silver Springs, if you remember back to those days. And this will be a virtual glass bottom boat ride where you can look down and see the fish go by, and you'll understand some of the things that are happening in the springs. And then end up in something called the Recharge Lounge, where we'll try to make sense of the story of water, what happens to water in our environment, and what are some of the challenges that we face as Floridians with our water supply, and what individuals can do to help shape the future of water in our state. So, not to bore you with a construction timeline, but really, here we are now. We're down into exhibit fabrication and the bid award. So the bid package is almost complete. We're a little bit behind, but it's going to go out for bid next month, and then we'll begin fabrication of different components. It'll be installed next late spring, summer, and we hope our exhibition opening is going to happen in September of 2023. supply chains notwithstanding and all the other challenges. That'll be exciting because it'll be the first renovation of one of our quote unquote permanent exhibitions in quite some time, and will move us in this direction of relevancy. So another thing that we do on the public side is community outreach. And these are some of the organizations with whom we partner around Gainesville. We provide content and both off-site and on-site for these organizations, which are becoming more diverse all the time as we try to serve all Floridians, not just the people that might feel the same way or we think might feel the same way that we do about issues, but trying to expand our outreach to serve Floridians of all different stripes. And here are some pictures of taking museum programs. This is museums in the park, and the idea is to take some of the objects and stories that we have outside of the museum's walls into parks and other settings around Gainesville to engage visitors who might not otherwise feel comfortable or have the means to get to the museum. And there's usually a lot of enthusiasm, and what we find is that these youngsters will then bring their parents to the museum in subsequent visits and will turn on a family to some of the topics that we hope to cover. We also do a lot of public programs at the museum. Can You Dig It with the geology department is a big one. We have tot trots where little children get to go through the natural areas. We have docents, volunteers, member previews, a new program capitalizing on some of our expertise and relating to people on the autism spectrum has been very popular, an overlooked component whose needs we were not able to meet. Women and girls in science. And you know what? They do allow women and girls in science these days. Can you imagine that? So some of our most recent hires of faculty curators and so forth have been very excited about being involved here. And we've hired some great new females across our spectrum. And then, of course, we have a program for all fourth graders in Alachua County to come to the museum, and we find the funds to bring them to the museum if their schools can't afford that. This is our discovery room, which is aimed at younger audiences. There's a lot of please touch experiences in there, and it's also staffed and programmed so that all these kids have a chance both to see the objects and learn about them, and if they have questions, talk to some staff members. Last week, I listened on Zoom as Jarrett Daniels talked about pollinators, and he mentioned the plant sale. So this was a plant sale we had back in April. We're going to have another one in the fall. And you can see it's very, very popular, and it's become a revenue source. So in gross sales, we had almost $60,000 in gross sales on Florida native plants. So, the net was less than that, but that money goes toward pollinator programs and conservation efforts with Jarrett and his team. And so we're happy to be contributors to that. I think he talked about the beer program. I don't think I put any beer slides in here, but that's also another very successful program. And it represents ways that the museum is exploring new avenues for support. So in terms of museum visitors, this is what museum visitation, this is through the door visitors, physical visits. And you can see this year that stands out. This was the year that we brought a T-Rex named Sue to Gainesville. So we had 90,000 visitors in 3 months that time. And then this is the year 2004, we opened the Butterfly Rainforest, which has increased visitation almost a quantum step. Now, the last couple years were not so great. We had basically 150,000 plus or minus each of those years. And this year, this slide is old because we've finished our fiscal year on June 30th. I didn't put in the new numbers, but we're up at about 205 this year. So May and June were very good. So we've really returned to pre-COVID levels in terms of visitation at the museum. Most people visit the museum virtually, though, and so this slide shows web page visits. These are web visits. This is the blue axis, if you will, over there. And so our web visits kind of declined for a while, but have picked back up so that we now have about 3.5 million web visitors per year. And the yellow is social media. So this has just continued to rise. This is the social media scale on this side. So we're approaching 300,000 visitors in social media. That's Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, Instagram. None of the things that I do, so I can't tell you much about that. But it's really important these days. I'm just teasing. So I've talked mostly about the public side of the museum, but I'm fond of showing this slide because it's, to me, it's very fundamental about what a proper museum is like. Just like an iceberg, when you're traveling on a ship, what you see is the little part of the iceberg that is exposed above the waves. And hiding underneath and supporting that is the larger part of the iceberg, what we call the research and collections. And it's that enterprise, that research and collection enterprise, that the educators and exhibit makers interpret, that the public sees, and that's what they think of as the museum. Whereas most of the real work occurs down here below the waves, basically out of sight for most visitors. And a lot of that happens in this building. Now, it doesn't look like this because this road is completely torn up. They're putting giant pipes down here, and you can't actually get there from this side of the street. And it's been that way for more than a year. It's been really tough getting to work, let's just put it that way. But soon that'll be finished, and this building, if you were to go inside, you'll see that this is the kind of thing, well, hopefully you wouldn't see all these drawers pulled out at the same time, but these are the kinds of things that you would see in Dickinson Hall. And the scientific collections, as John mentioned early on, are very large, very sizable, and represent a tremendous research resource. This is Dr. Larry Page, and I'm showing this one on purpose because a lot of the specimens that we have are stored in alcohol, which preserves the soft tissue. And so the state fire marshal has said, well, you've got an alcohol problem at the museum. It's not in the director's office, I assure you, but nevertheless, with hundreds of thousands of gallons of alcohol, ethanol, 70% stored in this building. The codes have changed over the years, and the state fire marshal has mandated that all those specimens get moved out of that building, which cannot be brought up to code because it's partly underground and there's not the capacity to have access and egress at frequent enough intervals. And so what that has meant is that we've had to build a purpose-built structure to house the specimens that are stored in alcohol. UF Building 373, and this is what it looks like. And this building is partly 2 stories, partly where the collections will be stored, partly 1 story where the labs and research areas are. This is a picture from a drone. So for orientation, at the top left, that's the back of the Phillips Center for Performing Arts at the top left. This is Powell Hall, This is the DPI building, the Doyle Connor building. And this is our new building under construction. All this, it's moved along. This is a picture from back in May or June. And all this is supposed to be paved by now. It was supposed to be paved in June. It was supposed to be paved the first week of July. It was supposed to be paved the second and third weeks of July. Can't get asphalt, no matter what. They just can't get any asphalt. So we're still waiting on that. That's part of the supply chain issues that we've been facing with the construction of the building. But inside, and again, this is a bit of an older picture, but these are the rails where those compact mobile high-density storage units are going to go so that they can slide back and forth. I'm sure you've seen them in libraries or in your doctor's offices where they have their mobile files stored. Similarly, this building is built to contain all the specimens that are stored in alcohol. So what does that mean? That means that there are no flammable components in this building. There are big drains in the floor that drain down to a central collection area. And you've seen probably in gas stations, these giant fiberglass tanks that are buried where the gas is. Well, we have a few of those out there. They're empty. Should there ever be a catastrophic failure, all the alcohol will drain into those big tanks so that it won't pollute the aquifer. And so we have spark arresters on all the lights. The temperature and humidity in the building going to be such that it reduces the opportunity for vapors to ignite. So all the safety concerns it has met of the state fire marshal and the environmental health and safety. So it's about a $13 million building. And once it's done, and it's scheduled to be handed over to us at the end of August, then comes the Herculean task of moving all those specimens from Dickinson Hall over to this building. And it's like a library because all those specimens are in a certain order by which family, class, family, etc., genus, species they're organized in. And that all has to be they have to be boxed up and then replicated over here because if they get out of order, it'd be really, really difficult to find some of those specimens. And so that's going to be a big challenge for our staff coming up. But this is what it will look like. A little fuzzy. Hopefully, maybe whoever took this picture was drinking some of the alcohol, I don't know, ahead of time. I hope not. And then this path leads to NATL, that Natural Area Teaching Lab, that way. So that connection is preserved. We also have a growing part of our collection are tissue collections, frozen tissue collections at liquid nitrogen temperatures. And they're in here. There are about 35,000 specimens of tissue that's stored there. I sign a loan agreement virtually every day for investigators around the world who want some of those tissues for DNA work. So it's a really important research resource. And as I mentioned before, this is a diagram that shows some of the main museums in, even around the world, but mostly in the United States. And so this is the National Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian. This is the Museum of Natural History in London, Musée d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. And there's the Florida Museum of Natural History with 40 million specimens. So it's pretty impressive that right here in your own backyard is one of the leading institutions for biological specimens. And I'm very proud of the fact that this museum is leading the National Science Foundation's effort to digitize the biological collections across the United States. So it's not the Smithsonian that was selected, it's not the Field Museum in Chicago or the American Museum in New York, but we won this competition. This is now $150 million over 15 years. About 50 million of that has come to the Museum of Natural History to lead this digitization effort. So we are the national hub for the collection, digitization, and integration. So ultimately, when all these collections are digitized and they're interoperable, you'll be able to sit in your stateroom here in Oak Hammock, and you'll be able to call up whatever species you're most interested in, plant, animal, fossil, and you'll be able to search all of the databases of all the museums in the US and see which ones have specimens that you might want to borrow or look at or photograph or study. And this will move the science forward in a huge step. And so let me just, this is a video that we made, and hopefully it works.
My name is Dave Blackburn. I'm the curator of amphibians and reptiles at the Florida Museum of Natural History. I'm a research scientist that studies the evolution of frogs. More so than ever, it is important now to tell the story of what used to be here and how things have changed. More so than ever is a time to excite kids about science and biodiversity and life. The way that collections are used just gets reinvented constantly. So we're always kind of trying to do science today, but also as museum scientists really being mindful of what might need to be done in the future. By being able to digitally look inside of these specimens, to characterize them without ever having to dissect something that's rare, we can suddenly learn really fundamental, interesting things about the biology of species. And all of that with a press of a button put online, and a large research community can suddenly use that information. All the while, we're describing new species, we're also losing them. So we describe as a community, say, about 100 new species of frog almost every year. But yet at the same time, we're slowly having population declines and extinctions happening worldwide. Museums can do now more so than really ever is to advocate for the changes that they're seeing. And I think we are poised now to do that better than ever, because unlocking our collections, the stories that we have here, we can suddenly have a global scope to our impact of our research, to excite people about biodiversity and science in general. And it's really what hopefully can help sway the tide to people caring about issues of conservation and biodiversity.
Okay, so people say, people ask me all the time, well, how big is your museum? And big is a complicated term. What does that mean? How many square feet? How many specimens do you have? How many people do you employ? What's your budget size? So I'll just get the budget size thing out of the way. This is a chart for the last 20 plus years of our overall museum budget. And when I started as museum director, yeah, I know I've been here that long, our budget was about $8.5 million. And the state, which is the dark blue overall budget, the state proportion of that was 80%. The state paid 80% of the bills. And you know, the state has done pretty well. It's kind of kept up with inflation almost, but you see where our budget is today, and the state portion of our budget is 37.6% last year. So a lot of what we do is based on philanthropy. It's based on earned income, ticket sales. It's based on grants and contracts in addition. So what we do is we take that state money that largely pays our salaries, and we multiply that so that we add a factor of 3, if you will, in terms of economic value to what the state provides. What do our faculty and staff do in addition to curating? We have about 390 full and part-time employees. Last year, they taught 43 courses. They chaired 108 grad student committees, served on 158 more graduate student committees as a committee member, and oversaw 122 independent study projects. One of our stellar faculty members is Dr. Pam Soltis, who this last year was recognized as UF Teacher Scholar of the Year, which is widely regarded as one of the highest accolades that a University of Florida faculty member can achieve. She's also a member of the National Academy of Science, a prolific researcher, and a wonderful human being. Our collection and research activities. So last year we had 543 scientific visitors to the collection. We made 243 loans of over 27,000 specimens. So that's specimens being either picked up or put in the mail to researchers around the world. And we have cataloged about 130, almost 140,000 new specimens into the collection. 62 new federal grants and contracts last year worth about $12 million. So we're doing real well. And we also, of course, contribute to the creation of new knowledge. So last year, our 29 curators had about 220 professional publications, peer-reviewed publications, books, monographs, and journal articles in scientific and technical journals. I won't dwell too much on this, but I think that your speaker last week, Jared Daniels, didn't really blow his own horn enough because he is quite a stellar curator himself and has been very, very important in terms of bringing some species back from the brink of extinction, like the Miami blue. And there's Jared. There were fewer than 20 of these animals left in the wild. In fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife said they're extinct until somebody, a woman in the Keys, found some in her backyard and called up, and we said, no, they're extinct. Take a picture. She took a picture, and darn if they were still around. So they've raised more than 20,000 of these butterflies since then and have released them back into the Everglades and Bahia Honda and other places. They get support from Disney Conservation Fund. These are other species that Jared and his team around the nation are working on. We also have conservation efforts in the sea. This is the small-tooth sawfish. That was the only one that during this period that was not tagged and seen and captured in Florida. This species used to extend from here all the way around the Gulf, all the way up to the New York Bight. This is where they live today, concentrated in this area, and we were able to get this species federally recognized as an endangered species, the first one in the sea. And so I think largely that's going to make sure that this species is around for your grandchildren to see. This is the guy who is largely responsible for that. George Burgess, who's just retired, used to keep our international shark attack file, which is a clearinghouse for any time a shark bites a human around the world. This is the clearinghouse for that information right here in Gainesville. Gustav Paule is a curator of invertebrates, and it's his survey work on the Gulf Coast, around Florida's Gulf Coast and around Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, that was able to document the die-off of marine creatures from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of a decade ago. We also are intimately concerned with the proliferation of Burmese pythons in the Everglades and elsewhere. These are some of the largest ones that have been collected and skinned out. They're about 18 feet long. This is one of our former Florida legislators who didn't really understand the nature of the problem until we invited them to come and see a necropsy of a gravid female that had 88 eggs in it. Oh, really? It's not just one for one, right? Okay. And so all of a sudden, our elected officials had a new understanding of the magnitude of that problem. And then we have excavations continuing over in Williston at our Montbrook fossil site. So this is a very promising fossil that's still in the ground over there. I have Gomphothea with a question mark because it might be a Gomphothea. This is, you can see, this is the foot, and then it goes up into the leg area, and there's even a string of vertebrae. We're not sure if it's a Gomphothea or if it's a mastodon, but either way we can't lose. If it's a mastodon, it's the oldest mastodon that's ever been found. If it's a Gomphothea and the skeleton is fairly complete, that's a win too, because there are no complete or even close to complete skeletons of a Gomphothea. Gomphothea is, you probably all know what a mastodon is. Gomphothea are a little less familiar, but those are the shovel tuskers. So the tusks aren't cylindrical, but they're shaped like this, and they would literally dig vegetation out of the swamp. So that's going to be an exciting find. That's going to be after the summer heat is passed and they get back out there in the fall. We're going to uncover that. And then there's, of course, a rhino that's nearby, and that's what those rhinoceros teeth look like up close. And this is, he's not asleep. This is for scale, I'm told, anyway. But yeah, here are the phalange and the leg bones you can see going all the way up. And then there are the beginnings of the vertebral column. So this could be a really exciting find with this extinct relative of elephants. And most people are just amazed that we had things like rhinos and elephants and lions and camels and many species of horses living in Florida in the past. So very dynamic state. Then the last thing I wanted to mention is one of the more recent initiatives at the museum, the Thomson Earth Systems Institute. And Bruce McFadden is currently the director. So what are Earth systems? The atmosphere, air, the hydrosphere, water, land, the geosphere, and life, the biosphere. And through a generous donation by some UF alums who said, people just don't get it. Floridians just don't get it, that all of these Earth systems are connected to one another. And when you perturb the composition of the atmosphere, you're going to potentially heat up the planet. And then that's going to melt the ice at the poles. It's going to, sea level is going to rise. That's going to affect the aquifers, the coastal aquifers. It's going to affect the beaches, and we're going to have erosion along our coastlines. So it affects the geosphere, and these climate changes already we can see have affected our biosphere, in that we have a lot of non-native species coming into our state and making a home here where they really aren't welcome in most cases. So getting the word out about this is the mission of the Thomson Earth Systems Institute. We used to argue, is climate change a real thing? Well, I don't think most people don't really want to argue about that anymore. You have to be have your head in the sand not to see what's going on. I have a friend who lives in one of the apartment buildings down here, who was going to get his car to go to work in the morning, and it was one of these king tides. So he went down, and he said, I always wear boots because often the parking garage is flooded. He said right by his car, out of one of the storm drains, an octopus came up out of the storm drain and was swimming around in the, in the parking garage. So, if you live in one of these areas like Tampa or Miami, it's more of a reality. I think with the warm weather, we certainly realize what's going on here, and all you have to do is look at wildfires in the West or the record temperatures in Europe, and you see what's going on. And part of our mission at the museum is not just looking at odd things under glass, but it's trying to educate a future generation about where we're headed as a society and as a people if we don't make some fundamental changes. And what can we do? And we're trying to help people not just pile on bad news, but help people figure out what they can do. So this is a diagram of some of the recent upcoming construction projects that are proposed for the UF Cultural Plaza. And so this is where our building that I showed you before, where the wet collections are going to be stored, is, back here. And this is the Phillips Center for Performing Arts, and they're talking about an addition to the front of the Phillips Center to increase the lobby space and redefine how that might look. Many of you have probably read about the fabulous collection of Florida art, the Vickers collection that the Harn Museum has acquired, and they have committed to an addition in the front of the Harn. I don't want to say that this is exactly what it's going to look like, but this is a diagram that the university has provided. And we are proposing a new addition to the front of Powell Hall that is also going to be home to our Thomson Earth Systems Institute. And so we're pretty close. The project is of this size. We have raised our private support, and we're hoping that the state is going to come through with a match. These are some of the spaces that are going to be included there, and this is going to help us to meet the needs of the future going forward. And so I'll just end with, I hope, a pretty picture, and I hope I've given you some inspiration as to what's in store for the museum and what a 21st century museum here in Gainesville looks like. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We have questions, comments?
First a comment. I hope that you showed an earlier picture of a sort of water lounge with a couple of nice chairs in the water project. Have you thought of making it a bourbon and water lounge? How has the COVID pandemic affected our museum, your job, and your buddies around the country's job?
Yeah, that's a.
You can stay over here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a really good, a complicated question. So here in Gainesville, we closed in March of 2020, but we reopened on January 1 of July 1 of 2020, because the governor told us to. So we weren't totally comfortable with doing that, but we did, masks and other protections in place. So we did okay. We kept people on for a while until we had to let some go. So we did. We had educators who were responsible for programs for school groups, but no school groups were coming to the museum, and these people had, nothing to do. And so we kept them on, but let them know that we only have enough money to do this for so long, and then we've lost some of our educators. We had special event people who were hired to coordinate special events at the museum. but no special events were happening at the museum, nor were they likely to for quite a while. And so we lost some people there. You know, I don't want to minimize the impact. We had people at the front desk who would take tickets, and nobody, you know, we were closed for several months. And so we lost some of those people. But most of the museum staff, you know, we lost between 5 and 7% maybe of the staff. And we, you know, when I hear what happened at other places, we came through it relatively unscathed. I mean, we're back up now, and I've been a member of a lot of different organizations, the Association of Science and Technology Centers, AAM, American Alliance of Museums. And so we would have these calls at least once a month. People would share what's going on, and many were closed for years, and they've lost, you know, a lot of people. So we came through relatively unscathed. And then outside of our museum, it's been an entire spectrum. So I don't know of any. Well, I do know of some museums that have just closed because they're reliant on earned income. You know, it was people paying an admission to come in, and those are the ones that suffered, you know, the most. Thank goodness for that state support that we had, and for some of those continuing grants where scientists could still work on from remotely. They could work on their research projects, and it still paid the bills for a while. So, yeah.
Julie, do you want to take the
Sure.
Zoom?
Sure, Phyllis, go ahead.
Dr. Jones, I just wanted to thank you personally for your leadership and dedication to this museum. I'm so very proud of Florida's Natural History Museum, with which I've been involved at one level or another for the 32 years I've lived in Alachua County. This is, we all can be so very proud to have the 4th or 5th largest collection in the world, and to do it handle it so well in a very compact space. And I'm talking here about Dickinson Hall. I also want to put it.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Okay. I also want to put in a plug for the fall ILR program on paleontology. I will discuss the science of paleontology, and probably more interesting to the audience, what the paleontologists at Florida Museum do. And I think we've put together a good program, and thank you very much for the opportunity to make that plug.
Thanks, Phyllis.
Hey, hi, Doug. I wanted to know what your plans were for all the liberated space in Dickinson.
Spoken like a true administrator there, Jane. Thank you. Yes, so we have, well, in addition to Dickinson Hall and Powell Hall, we lease about 8 warehouses in Gainesville, and most of which are climate controlled, and it's a big expense. But I'm reluctant to bring any of that material back into Dickinson Hall since it's doing pretty well, where it is. So I think that what we're going to do is provide, we're going to move collections around, and that will give us in Dickinson probably another 20 years of growth potential in that building. So that's the plan right now. And it's probably going to fall to the next museum director to articulate what that actually means. But unless, wait, who's hearing this? Well, unless Tiger Hall swoops in and tells us they're going to take over that space and put some other program in there, which, as you know, can always happen. I'm trying to, forestall that, because most of those collections that are in alcohol are stored on compactors, and we're not going to move those compactors. They're old, and we're putting new ones over in the new building. So I think we're going to just reposition some of our collections. And, you know, you've been in those spaces. They're not very capacious. They're not really nice for students or anything. So I think there's limited other things they can do with that space, but it'll give us growth for a couple of decades, I'm hoping there. And a nice thing about it is many of you probably, some of you will remember back when we used to have open houses at Dickinson Hall. But the fire marshal said you can't do that because of the fire hazard of all this alcohol, so we had to stop that program. Well, once that moves out, we'll be able to have open houses again, and scout groups can come back in, or, you know, the public will, with a little reservation, will be able to show them behind the scenes and the collections which they own. I mean, we just hold them in keeping for the citizens of the state. So hopefully that will help us explain what is in that bunkered building that's very confusing to a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, that will be wonderful. Going to Dickinson Hall brings you a whole new perspective.
Yeah.
I do have another question here on chat, and you may have answered. It says, which local water resource organizations are you working with for the new water exhibit?
Yeah, we've had quite a bit of stakeholder input. We've had Bob Knight and the Florida Springs Institute. We've had the UF Water Institute. We've had representatives from the St. John's and Suwannee River Water Management districts. We've had people from GRU. We've had school teachers and science teachers. We've had hydrologists from the UF Department of Geology and from the Florida Geological Survey. So I think we've involved a lot of different constituents in the design of the exhibit, and I'm hoping it's going to be really popular and meet the needs of our community. It's a good question.
Any other questions here?
It's a good question, because a lot of that happens outside of public view. You know, we try to do our homework there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Other questions?
All right. Well, I'll just say thank you very much. It's been really nice to see some old friends again. Yeah.
And next week, come back to hear about the dinosaur and how the age of the dinosaur ends. So we hope to see you here same time next week. And thanks again, Dr. Jones.